Well, first this is from Bijeljine, which is considered by many the first battle in the war in Bosnia. Happened before April 6th in 1992. And here you see Harush Zabiri. He's a Macedonian Albanian who was working in Bijeljine, and he is essentially one of the first prisoners of the Bosnian War. And the Serbian paramilitary group, the Tigers, told me to photograph him. They show that they quote-unquote found some pistols. Therefore, he's a terrorist because he's an Albanian. Harush was then brought to Arkan's headquarters, brought inside, and while I was waiting outside, he came out of the window and landed on the ground. And the paramilitaries, the Tigers, doused him with water. They said that they were baptizing him. They kicked him, they punched him. He survived the fall. They brought him back into the house. The next day I went to the hospital to see if he was there, because if he had survived, he would be in the hospital, and I couldn't find him. It was until probably 12 years later, no, it was probably 15 years later, that I got contacted on Facebook by a relative of Harush that told me the story of what had happened. That he was killed probably later that day or the next day, but it wasn't until 12 years later they found his body and identified him by DNA. And he was then sent back, his body was sent back to his family in Macedonia, and he was buried there. I went to Macedonia and met his family and tried to explain why I couldn't save their son. And it was a very difficult and sad conversation, but they were, in fact, actually very thankful that Harush's death stood for something, and that this photograph was used in the War Crimes Tribunal. So this actually wasn't taken in the war in Bosnia. This photograph was taken during the Croatian War. Arkan had, who's the Serbian leader of the Tigers, a paramilitary group, had already started to become quite well known for their brutality and the actions that they were taking. And myself and Alzan Jabullah, another photographer from Seven, went to the headquarters in Erdut to meet him and to ask if we could document them in their next battle. And Arkan was very smart, very charming, and thought he was incredible. Alexandra was a very beautiful French photographer, and he tried to charm her. And she asked, "Can we take a portrait of you?" And he said, "Oh yeah, of course, no problem." And he got all his men, and they stood up on a tank, and Arkan posed for a picture. And just before I was about to take this photograph, somebody handed him a live baby tiger, which he had said that he had, quote unquote, liberated from a Croatian zoo. And my photograph turned out to be one that he liked very much. And when I met him a few months later in Bijeljine, that he remembering that I had taken that photograph allowed me access to when they were fighting in Bosnia. So I was in Slovenia, then I was in Croatia, I was in Vukovar when Vukovar fell, and arrived in Belgrade at the end of March 1992 when everybody was talking about the danger of a war starting in Bosnia. When Bijeljine, the fighting started in Bijeljine between the civilians, I went and started to work there. And by the third or fourth day, Arkan arrived. And having liked my photograph of him with the tiger, he gave me permission to go off with one of his units, which we did. We went to the center of town, they went into a mosque, they took down the Islamic flag, they posed for a photograph, and then I heard some shouting from across the street. I walked outside, and a couple had been brought out. Hamieta and Abdurrahman Paizeti were brought out of a house right behind this wall. They were brought out. This is Hamieta, this is her husband Abdurrahman. Everybody was screaming, the soldiers were screaming at me not to take photographs. Shots rang out, Abdurrahman fell to the ground, and I managed to take this photograph of Hamieta and her husband. Moments later, they brought out another woman, Aisha Shabanovic. This is her. And then she too was shot. And so I managed to take this photograph of this tiger. His name is Serjan Golubovich, and the two other tigers. As they interact, you see the cigarette in one hand, the sunglasses on top of his head. And this photograph basically was the definition of ethnic cleansing. This is what ethnic cleansing looked like. The photograph was published around the world and nobody cared, and everybody ignored it. And I felt that my work had failed. I had failed the people in Bosnia, because I thought that this would be enough evidence to push people into intervening in Bosnia. So eventually the photograph became more and more well known and became a symbol for the war in Bosnia, and was used in numerous trials at The Hague. In fact, in 1993, when The Hague opened, one of the speeches during opening day said the photograph was the inspiration for the creation of the tribunal, and was used as recently as just a few months ago in the last trial that closed out the Hague. So this represents, I think, the brutality of the conflict, and I hope today, given the conversations that are going on with Dodik and others about being very familiar to what was said 30 years ago, that possibly there could be another war. Everybody should remember images like this and realize they don't want to go back in the same direction.